This video is brought to you by Patreon. Thank you for your incredible support. Stardust Crusaders is a totally different experience than I was expecting. Araki's all like, I'm glad you liked the last two arcs because here's something completely different. And to be perfectly honest, I found this to be viciously interesting and, to my surprise, inspirational. For a mangaka to not only throw out the magic system he spent 7 large volumes establishing, but to also completely change the format with which he structures his stories is not only whiplash-inducingly unconventional, but as I've learned by talking to friends about Part 3, is also pretty controversial. This is a polarizing arc to say the least, and one that I'm grateful has given me an opportunity to explore from a narrative point of view why that might be. But most importantly, I can't wait to give you all my opinion on what is the first JoJo part I'm going into largely blind. This was the point where I stopped watching the anime, and let me tell you, I did not stop reading the manga. In fact, this was the arc that convinced me that Araki is not only exceptionally brave, but incredibly clever also. Perhaps even in ways you might not have ever noticed. So, get your stand ready, put on your best hat hair, and let's go on a long sprawling adventure because I'm totally not Mark, and this is my review of the arc that changed everything we knew about JoJo's bizarre adventure. This is the controversial, the stylish, and the inspirational Stardust Crusaders. Okay, so Phantom Blood was 44 chapters long, Battle Tendency was 69.
Nice.
But Stardust Crusaders, well, it's a bit longer, and by a bit longer, I mean it's 152 chapters. This is a story that is more than twice as long as Battle Tendency and more than 3 times the length of Phantom Blood. It's long, and that's not a bad thing. However, what it does mean is that it's going to be too long to cover in just one video. And so this week, I'll be reviewing the first half, and next week, I'll tackle the rest. And because I'm a professional, in preparation for this video, I marinated myself in every piece of pop culture that defined the year that this arc was released, 1989, which included but was not limited to the first season of The Simpsons, Lethal Weapon 2, and who could forget the iconic and most aggressively 1989 experience to be released perhaps ever. I am of course speaking of the pinnacle of entertainment and generation-defining television program, Saved by the Bell. Praise be unto Zach Morris. This research proved to be invaluable. Stardust Crusaders, released in 1989 but set in 1987 Japan, follows the adventures of one Kujo Jotaro as he learns of his new abilities thanks to the help of his grandpa and friend Abdul. Soon after this, it's revealed that Dio has returned, and with this, certain powers have surfaced within the Joestar family. With Jotaro and his grandpa being strong enough to control them, Jotaro's mother Holly is not and is on the verge of death. Thus is the motivation for Jotaro and his merry band of friends to travel across the world to stop Dio in Egypt, making this story, particularly in the first half, a long road trip type story spanning many different locations, perfectly mirroring November 18th, 1989 Saved by the Bell episode, wherein Zack wants to go on a field trip only for it to get cancelled later. And funnily enough, while Stardust Crusaders' story is long, it's not necessarily because there's a lot of story. In fact, it's remarkably barren in that department. And boy, do I have a lot to discuss about the characters, the plot, and the structure of this particular section. I've done a lot of research for this arc, which turned out to be, honestly, unlike anything I've come across before. So, let's start at the beginning where I think this story's greatest strengths lie, before we dive into its controversial material later. The setup. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I hadn't seen the vast majority of Stardust Crusaders, and that's true, but I did see the beginning of the arc, and if there's one thing that Araki does narratively really well, it's introducing new characters, particularly his main protagonist. In a similar fashion to Jonathan and Joeseph within Phantom Blood and Battle Tendency, he manages to, in one scene, introduce us, endear us to, and get us familiar with the protagonist of this particular section, Kujo Jotaro, a 195 centimeter tall, stoic tough guy that is far more reserved than any other JoJo that's come before him. Immediately, this stands in direct contrast to Jonathan Joestar, who is also in this arc. Completely distinct to any other JoJo that came before him, Jotaro boasts a much deeper and more reserved demeanor at almost all times. Pictured as a young boy in the opening pages, as we turn to the second, we are greeted by our new protagonist now in a jail cell. Apart from the situation being immediately interesting, the way Araki uses the scene to build up to the rest of the story is honestly brilliant. Abrasive and unkind from the outset, this Jotaro character is clearly nothing like anything we've seen before in the series, sporting honestly my favorite design out of any JoJo I've seen so far. Although, from my own observations online, this JoJo is not without his detractors. But for me on this outing, I grew to appreciate his unique brand of engagement with the story and even grew to love it in some parts. His no-nonsense, straightforward and abrasive persona really makes certain lines of dialogue hit wonderfully well. For instance, in the opening chapters, JoJo is in this jail cell not because the police want him there. In fact, it's the opposite. He is in there because he believes that he's haunted by a spirit that can hurt people, and not wanting to hurt anyone, he places himself there by his own volition. And while he's unkind and disconnected from any meaningful relationship he supposedly has in the outside world, including his own mother, introduced also to us within this scene are two very important characters both in this tale and Jotaro's life, the returning Jonathan Joestar and Jotaro's mother, Holly. I found it to be honestly refreshing to see a familiar face I was so fond of in the prior arc surface and play a large role in this one too, albeit he most definitely doesn't have the same sway over the series like he used to, partially because of the change in the magic system, but I'll get to that in a moment. Once again, this scene does a fantastic job in establishing Jotaro's mother and re-establishing Jonathan Joestar as they try to engage with and coax out of hiding the increasingly adamant Jotaro before he eventually battles with Magician's Red, the power of one Muhammad Abdul and friend of Joeseph Joestar. Now, something that might come as a surprise to anyone that hasn't watched or read this section of the manga is that the bulk of the story I'll be discussing today actually takes place in the first 12 chapters or so, and then something happens that I will absolutely be talking about in a moment.
What the fuck?
Simply because that aspect of the story is seen quite negatively among the fandom, and I've actually got something I think I can add to the conversation. But to cut a long story short, Dio is back, a new power system comes to the forefront of this arc, and because this new power requires a strong will to wield, when Jotaro's mother, Holly, gains the new ability thanks to her Joestar bloodline lineage and can't control it, Jotaro immediately jumps into action and seeks out Dio to free his mother from this curse. And while on the surface that action doesn't sound like much or anything that would be noteworthy, coming from Jotaro it absolutely is. From his time spent in jail to protect others from himself, to his time spent at school defending others from a possessed Kakyoin that joins the party later, Jotaro exudes all the emotion of a plank of wood, and in my first experience with the anime, this element bothered me to a point of despising him. However, this time around with the manga, I felt that because of that stoicism, the brief moments where the cracks start to show in his persona actually make a big impression on the reader, with my personal favorite example of this being observed in the relationship he has with his own mother. A number of times during the first 10 chapters, he openly and loudly dismisses his mother like the stereotypical delinquent he's portrayed to be. However, when he notices that she looks pale, and when she doesn't show up to kiss him, he wonders where she's gone to. While these examples are in the anime, there are others that aren't quite as overt. These are small moments in isolation, but they paint a bigger picture of a character who is virtuous and kind behind that masquerade, and it is by far my favorite aspect of his character. However, for most people, their favorite aspect of the story is not Jotaro. While many might love him or think he's awesome, because, okay, he is, I'd be willing to wager that this arc is as iconic as it is because of one specific element I've neglected to talk about thus far. Stands. This is largely why this is my favorite setup out of all the JoJo arcs thus far, and not only does this act as our inauguration to the character of Jotaro, but also facilitates introductions to much of the cast, establishes relationships, and impresses upon us one very new addition to the series, the iconic JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stand Magic System. Stands as a system of power and battle are much more easily diversifiable than Hammond was, and thanks to Araki's wonderful implementation of them, they have become synonymous with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure at this point. Acting effectively as manifestations of one's own personal willpower, they come in all different shapes and sizes, and everyone gets their own unique stand. Jotaro's stand comes to be known as Star Platinum, and while he's the most simple of all the stands we see in this series, in that he is super fast and punches really hard, his appearances are made to look all the more impressive because his intense and fast movements stand in direct contrast with Jotaro's reserved and stoic persona. Once again, Jotaro's personality serves to enhance more elements of this story.
どうやって説明しようかっていう、そういうところがスタンドにはちょっとあって、でもなんかキャラクターがいっぱいあるからなんか無限に描けるなと思ったんですよね。いくらでもこれアイデア出るよと思って、なんかねこう、なんか金庫を掘り当てたみたいなね。
And this story is full of stands. Hammond is old news and stands are here to stay. Once the goal of traveling to Egypt to do battle with Dio and to stop his evil ways comes to the forefront of our heroes' minds, pretty much every other character we meet along the way has a stand, and you best believe they more often than not are sent by Dio to stop the team of Jotaro, Joeseph, Kakyoin, Abdul, and Panare from reaching Egypt. This is a story 3 generations in the making, Dio now wielding the body of Joseph's grandfather, Jonathan, after he sacrificed himself for the betterment of his family and mankind, is now the body puppet of Dio, who is, in the manga, depicted in shadow for multiple volumes before he's eventually revealed properly. It's a great premise for a story and one I am totally on board with. Now, some of you out there who might be new to this series might be asking, okay, stands are cool and all, but what about Hammond? Why do I see a distinct lack of Hammond? And since Zach Morris can freeze time, does he have a stand too? All perfectly valid questions. And while I can't speak with absolute certainty regarding Zach Morris's standing in the JoJo continuity, when it comes to the disappearance of Hammond, I think it's an understandable question for fans of the series to ask. What gives Where's My Hammond? Because Joeseph and Jonathan spent massive sections of their respective stories learning these fundamental elements of the system in order to compete against the evil that they came up against. And in Stardust Crusaders, Hammond is barely ever mentioned. I can see why this might have rubbed fans of Hammond the wrong way, however, now after reading up to this point in the series and after reading Araki's book, I think that's with good reason. You see, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is structured somewhat unconventionally compared with other long-running shonen in that its main character consistently changes from story arc to story arc. This does wonders for the series in keeping it feeling distinct from other popular series within the issue of Weekly Shonen Jump, but it regrettably has, I believe, an irritating side effect, specifically when it came to implementing the Hammond power system. There are obvious benefits in switching from Hammond to stand powers. When Araki as a writer adopted stands, they granted him the flexibility to give any person any ability, which automatically injects tons of opportunity for creative storytelling. However, I don't believe this to be the only positive that influenced that decision to shift gears entirely. I mean, let's not forget, JoJo switching from Hammond to stands would be like if Dragon Ball switched from Ki to Pokemon battles.
Vegeta! Look! A Pokemon!
I'm not a Pokemon, I'm Chaozu!
So why the need to change things so completely and fundamentally? And why stop using Hammond altogether? Well, as I said, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure's structure was unlike many long-running shonen at the time. Teaching Hammond to Jonathan was great as it gave us the audience a chance to better understand the power system, and it was great getting to see that progression for the main character. However, when it came time for Joeseph to become the protagonist, Araki was then faced with an interesting problem. How does he write Jonathan Joestar to learn Hammond without it being boring? And the conclusion he came to was that he never taught Joeseph Hammond, he just knew it by instinct. And this was by design. And interestingly, Araki draws attention to this aspect of storytelling in his book Manga in Theory and Practice. He talks about avoiding the temptation to go negative with your characters and to always be progressing in an ever-rising direction. Under the rule of rises and falls, you are allowed to start in a negative place and have the movement rise from there. But when it comes to that ever-rising direction, you can't make any compromises. Interestingly, Hammond presented Araki with a very unique problem. How can he have a series where every single time he starts a new arc, he has to teach the protagonist how to use the Hammond power over and over without resetting to a point with each arc? The answer? He couldn't. Joeseph started from a place far more advanced than Jonathan did, and really that was the last time he could, in theory, up the ante on that. And the solution he came up with to remedy this dilemma was stands. With stands, he can introduce new characters easily and keep things interesting without retreading old ground, because the stand can be as wacky and different as he needs it to be. From a writing standpoint, this, while initially jarring to fans of Hammond, the Hammond power system simply couldn't work long-term with its structure, and thus an elegant solution was implemented with stands. Personally, I really enjoyed the implementation of stands in the story. They add an immense amount of variety to it, and on top of that, lend opportunities for a mangaka like Araki to get as creative as possible. I mean, this one was a boat and its wielder was an orangutan.
Don't do that again.
Okay.
Alright, so there's no avoiding the topic that Stardust Crusaders is really long on top of the fact that they already fundamentally changed the formula of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Last week, I released a poll on my Twitter asking JoJo fans in my audience if they liked Stardust Crusaders. The results, while not being overwhelmingly negative, did have a sizable portion of over 1 in 5 specifically stating that they did not like it. However, what was most interesting were the comments within the comments section. Comment after comment filled that section citing that the arc dragged on too long, and that they didn't like the episodic standalone nature of its telling, leading for it to feel, to some people, overly boring at times. Yet, strangely, this is the arc that supposedly launched JoJo's Bizarre Adventure into the mainstream. This is the one people point to as the part when the series really starts to get good. In other words, a vocal minority disliked it somewhat or hated the arc, while others loved it. And that dichotomy in opinion honestly fascinated me. So much so it led me down a rabbit hole, the likes of which brought to my attention a newfound respect for Araki as a writer.
あれはその第3部っていうのはこう一種のこうロールプレイングゲームの形を取ったストーリーなんですね。なんかすごろくゲームみたいなここ行こうここで戦っていくっていう80日間世界一周っていう小説あるんですけど、それの影響で作った話なんですね。
In Araki's book, Manga in Theory and Practice, he mentions that around the time Battle Tendency was reaching its conclusion, the series was struggling in reader surveys. Now, okay, I can already see a few of you glazing over from here, so you might be wondering, what are these reader surveys? Well, in the case of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, because it was released in Weekly Shonen Jump, when Araki submitted new chapters of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure to be published, it did so alongside numerous other mangakas submitting their latest chapters. These Weekly Shonen Jump issues were filled with tons of different popular stories that needed to stand out. And none were more popular than Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball at the time. However, because they were filled with so many different stories, they couldn't rely on Weekly Shonen Jump sales figures, and so instead supplied readers surveys at the end of each issue, asking them what their favorite running stories were. Series that did not perform well in these surveys consistently ran the risk of being cut from the publication. And the more I read about this, it became increasingly more interesting to me that Araki decided to go against every suggestion he received from the higher-ups and crafted a story like Stardust Crusaders, which is, as I mentioned above, unlike anything else that came before it in the series. But not just because of stands, because of how it was structured too. What's with Stardust Crusaders' bizarre episodic pacing? Once the goal is established and the motivation is made clear in venturing to Egypt to stop Dio and to save Jotaro's mother Holly, the story suddenly changes the format it's implemented since the very beginning of the series, changing from a serialized story to an episodic or Monster of the Week format. For those of you that don't know, serialized stories are narratives like Dragon Ball, One Piece, or Attack on Titan, where there's a clear progression and each chapter informs and furthers the story in obvious ways that typically don't repeat. Episodic storytelling, on the other hand, is closer to shows like Power Rangers. Every week there's a new monster to defeat, and thus a pattern appears. They fight as Rangers before eventually being overpowered, and they hop into their Zords, and boom, they win. This is a formula that gets reiterated time and time again until the story is ready to proceed, and some people found that irritating, specifically nowadays. Now, if you recall at the beginning of this video, I put up a poll on my Twitter asking the fans of JoJo if they liked Stardust Crusaders. Now, the vast majority said yes. However, what I haven't mentioned yet was that I put up a second poll also. This one asked, do you like Stardust Crusaders' Monster of the Week format? And the results were very different. Clearly, I struck a nerve. In other words, there's not much story within this part of Stardust Crusaders, and this bothered a significant chunk of the fan base. Once the setup is established and the characters go on their merry way, Jotaro and the crew might as well be walking through Mount Moon, encountering Zubat after Zubat, because the number of random encounters they get on their way to Egypt is quite relentless. Additionally, that's also predominantly why in this video it sounds like I've only just started talking about the story, because in this section of it, there's really very little meat to discuss beyond the different stand users they encounter time and time again as they get closer to their goal of Egypt. And the reason behind this seemingly sudden and insane narrative decision to change the format of the story turned out to be one of the single most interesting discoveries I made regarding JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and maybe even any review I've ever done. In response to poor reader surveys during Battle Tendency, Araki's response was Stardust Crusaders, an episodic, non-narratively driven road trip across the globe to Egypt. At the time, as I said, within the publication Weekly Shonen Jump, Dragon Ball was extremely popular among readers. And at the time, Dragon Ball had just finished a series of tournament arcs, and as a result, editors working for Shonen Jump would suggest tournaments be written into any of the stories that were struggling. And in his book, Araki speaks on this. During the height of the popularity of the tournament manga, I was able to approach them as a reader and enjoy the excitement, but I couldn't help help but wonder, from a creator's point of view, what the mangaka would do after the top of the tournaments. At the time, JoJo was struggling in the reader surveys, and people even suggested that I add a tournament format to help me gain popularity. Despite this advice to go for the safe, easily understood, serialized format of a tournament, which would have also given him plenty of opportunity to demonstrate the stand powers in a much more easy to control environment, he instead effectively does the opposite. Not only ignoring all the advice he was given, but turns the series on its head, effectively changing a lot of what made JoJo, well, JoJo for the existing reader base. And there are plenty of cons to this. Typically speaking, for a long-running shonen, serialization works much more effectively at telling engaging character-driven stories, with each chapter enjoying the opportunity for cliffhangers to help sustain its reader base. And at this point, fans of the series might actually start to notice that during this section there aren't that many cliffhangers, and even if you look at shows that use episodic format to their benefit, like early Simpsons or Rick and Morty, these shows would turn the absurdity up to 11 and perform a host of different crazy stories all the time to help keep an audience engaged. However, with Stardust Crusaders, it very much follows the exact same format over and over again. Show up in an area, the team notices that something isn't quite right. It's the work of an enemy stand user. They then fight that user, and that user eventually falls. And they repeat this ad nauseum with slight variations here and there. It seems as though there's no benefit, but there actually is. With the format of episodic Monster of the Week storytelling, the story suddenly becomes incredibly accessible. The way the format often works is that it lends well to establishing existing main characters for the sake of a new viewer or reader time and time again with each chapter, which is largely why the side characters in this story feel more engaging. They get much more screen time, and as a result, the opportunity to build themselves up. And suddenly, because of this easy accessibility, Stardust Crusaders abruptly didn't need its reader base to catch up with the near 100 chapters of material that already existed.
Shame.
And instead, they could just hop on this easy to understand journey at any point and enjoy the standalone encounters that popped up time and time again, and in that time, get to know all the characters and eventually, the story. In other words, Araki ignored the advice of professionals that thought they knew better and instead risked everything he built in a ridiculously competitive industry on his own understanding of how story works, while also introducing and establishing a brand new power system in stands that he wasn't fully to grips with yet.
Absolute madness!
That is one of the bravest things I've ever heard a mangaka do. So often in pop culture and media do visionaries take the safe route and copy what's popular. I'm sure you've all noticed it when everything game related wanted to mimic Fortnite's success in implementing a battle royale feature. You saw it when DC wanted to fast track its franchise into being an ensemble hero team like the Avengers, and you saw it when Dragon Ball's success informed the countless tournament arcs of its time. But what isn't spoken about nearly enough are the visionaries, the true visionaries, that when faced with certain doom, grit their teeth, dig their heels in, and declare that they understand how their medium works and that they genuinely believe in their own ideas, regardless if no one else does so. And from those truly brave writers and illustrators, you don't get stories that try to copy something else to gain popularity. You instead get an iconic franchise that spans generations. You don't need to be inspired, instead you're the one making something that inspires others. And so, while I haven't spoken too much about the strange and bombastic journey that Jotaro and his friends underwent on their way to Egypt, I really don't think the important aspects of it are the details of this particular journey, but the philosophy behind its creation. Stardust Crusaders, while I didn't love its first half's format, through my research it has become a story that I respect more than possibly any other I've ever read in my life, and it deserves to be known as the iconic arc it's become. Thanks for watching, guys. I know I didn't cover a lot of the meat and potatoes regarding the stand battles this week, particularly in this section, but I promise next week when I cover the second half and climax of this long journey, I'll also go back over some of these stand battles in more detail, and I'll tell you all my favorites, because if there's anything the ending of Stardust Crusaders taught me, it's
when I wake up in the morning and the alarm gives out a warning, I don't think I'll ever make it on time. By the time I grab my books and I give myself a look, I'm at the corner just in time to see the bus